Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be reacting to a video called The Secret of the Scandinavian Economic Miracle. So it looks like something positive. It's an economic miracle. I have no idea what the economic miracle is. I don't know if it's referring to the actual, because I think Scandinavian countries usually tend to be like pretty successful. Like they tend to have like pretty solid economies and people like earn very well. And maybe that's what it's referring to. I don't know, but hopefully it's going to be something positive. So let's check it out and comment, like, and subscribe.
Almost any list measuring human development around the world, you can be sure about one thing, that these 5 countries will be somewhere in the top 10. Whether it's the state of democracy, human rights, lack of corruption, trust between citizens, social cohesion, gender equality, human development index, happiness index, it's always the same. Looking at those lists, Scandinavia just seems to be best at, well, everything. It looks like these few countries somehow found a recipe for success, a unique combination of economic policies and social values that became known as the Nordic model. But what is the Nordic model exactly, and why is it so successful? Is the reputation of the Scandinavian countries deserved? And if it is, then why don't we replicate their model everywhere?
That's my question.
This is the secret of Scandinavian success, the Nordic model. The answer to all of this is a little complicated, but the best way to start might be at a time when Scandinavia was not doing so well, and when it was going through one of its biggest crises and facing a number of pretty severe economic and political challenges in the interwar period of the 1930s. Back then, the region was, like most of the world, badly affected by the Great Depression, the worst economic crisis of the 20th century, and the Nordic countries were hit pretty hard. The unemployment was extremely high, almost at 40% in Denmark. Businesses were bankrupting, and even independent farmers, who made up a backbone of the economy, were struggling just to get by. And just as in other parts of Europe, the economic hardship was fueling political radicalism and populism, as extremists on both sides of the spectrum were becoming more popular. Scandinavian communists were trying to overthrow the system through class warfare, creating rifts in the society and turning the lower classes against the elites, while fascists were attacking the nature of democracy itself, presenting it as ineffective and weak. To get through the crisis, the Nordic countries had to respond in a way that would address both.
I think usually and you can see it's like a tale as old as time, with not just with political parties, like preying on vulnerability when people are going through like hardship, but I think you can also see like it's just human nature. When people are in vulnerable states, I think it's easier for them to like fall prey to like scams, for instance. So in this situation, like usually when stuff like bad things are on the rise, it's usually because they're trying to like prey on vulnerability, and people are going through hardships, hard times, and that's like the perfect scenario for extremists to actually be successful, because again, you're preying on vulnerability, and people are like, well, yes, they're trying to find a way out. So it's quite easy for those things to like actually foster, because you're just like, I don't know, you're seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, and no one is actually like offering you that. So it's not a surprise that those bad things were on the rise back in those days.
Both the economic crisis and the political challenges, and the solutions that all of them chose defined what the Nordic model is, and what Scandinavia would have looked like in the following decades. First, the Nordic countries decided that the way to keep the society together in the times of the crisis is through a massive state spending and government-funded programs to help the people affected by the economic hardships. Previously existing measures like unemployment benefits and old age pensions were massively expanded, aiming to provide at least some means for people who are out of job or too old to get one. And they were complemented by a number of other welfare measures aimed at improving the lives of the lower classes, subsidies for decent public housing, or benefits for families with children. This is when the modern welfare state was born and became a first key part of the Nordic model. In the following decades, the Nordic countries continued to expand on those core programs established in the 1930s, but the basic idea is still the same. To keep the society together and to keep different classes from clashing, you need to help the lower classes that need helping the most, and you need to integrate them into the society rather than to
you don't want to create like a rift.
And the idea is that even though this can cost a lot of money, it's still worth it.
It's
because
better in
if
the
you
long
don't
term.
help them, the poverty, homelessness, and unemployment will end up costing you even more. That's why the welfare state in Scandinavia casts a wide social safety net, making sure that even when you lose your job, you won't hit rock bottom. And the state is actively trying to help you
As it
get
should
back on
be.
your feet and back into the workforce as fast as you can. Because, as opposed to what many people might think, the point of the Scandinavian welfare state is not to keep people hooked on the state benefits
No, of course
forever,
not.
but rather
To
the
help you.
opposite. Scandinavian countries are surprisingly strict and generous at the same time. People
So
who
you
are
have used the
left
system.
without a job are given generous unemployment benefits, but only as long as they are actively seeking work. And following the
Great.
same pragmatic logic, the Scandinavian welfare state puts a lot of effort into trying to elevate the poor to become the middle class. The idea is
That's
the same.
good.
A strong middle class and economically equal society is good for social cohesion, while having a lot of very poor people is both expensive and creates a divided society.
Yeah, I think, like, why wouldn't you want, and not just like the governments and people in power, like just you as a normal person, wouldn't you want like other people, like you want people to thrive, you don't want people to just be miserable and poor and homeless. Like you would want, yes, I want a good society in which everyone can thrive and have homes and be just happy in general. So it is like, that's, I think like that's the model, like that's how it should be, right? It shouldn't be like that surprising, like, oh, I want people to lead like successful lives. Like it's not like a controversial thing, I should say. I don't know, I think.
That's why the Nordic education, healthcare, and social services are free or almost free for everyone, and focus, at least in theory, on making sure that everyone has a more or less equal opportunity to build a solid career and have a decent quality of life.
Opportunities should
The
be like
downside
that.
of this is that the welfare state doesn't come free, and the Nordic
It's expensive.
countries have famously high taxes. In Denmark, the average person pays 45% of their income on taxes, compared to 22% in the United
45,
States and
wow.
24% in the UK. But
that's a
taxes in
lot.
Scandinavia are not just a way to provide the state with enough money to pay for everything, but they also serve as a tool for redistributing wealth and helping to keep the income inequality low. Basically, it's harder to become really wealthy, and it's also harder to become extremely poor. But it's relatively
It's
easy
good.
to
It's like-
stay somewhere in the middle. When this
It's
concept
average.
was first formed in the 1930s, in Sweden it was called folkhemmet, people's home, implying that the state is not just a detached bureaucratic body, but rather a home or a family for its people. In this
But that's-
concept, all citizens
that's
are
good.
part of this family.
Yeah,
and
it-
as such,
I can see why they did
everyone
that.
needs to be treated fairly and equally. And even more importantly, the common good of everyone,
Yeah, they're trying
of
to, like,
the
integrate
family
you
as a whole, is what
like, a
really
thing.
matters, and it is more important than the good of the individual. This is somewhere in the middle
The
between the
opposite.
super individualistic model in the United States, where
Yeah.
the state is there only to provide the basic minimum
And everyone's for
everyone should
themselves.
rely on themselves, and the totalitarian communist model in the Soviet Union, where the rights of the individual were basically non-existent. That's why the Scandinavian model became famous during the Cold War in the English-speaking world as the middle way. Second part of the Nordic model,
So
which
everyone's in
was
the middle.
also born in the 1930s, is what became known as the Great Compromise. In Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, unions of employees and unions of employers agreed that in order to prevent a conflict between different classes, they must find a compromise that would make everyone happy. And so through
That's the
different
ideal.
agreements, employers in all the Nordic countries agreed to guarantee decent wages, safe working conditions, and a maximum of 10 working hours per day for everyone,
Oh,
while the
10 hours.
employees agreed not to protest and strike as long as their
long as they're-
employers kept their word. This
That's
unique
good.
model of cooperation between workers and business owners remains until today, and
Oh,
many of the
wow.
working conditions are negotiated directly without the intervention of the state. That's
Oh.
why, for example, Nordic countries don't actually have a national minimum wages that would be
Oh, they
mandated
don't?
by the government. At the same time, a different compromise was reached.
I have to say it's crazy just looking at like the theory of it all. Like it makes obviously you're putting it like that and it makes sense, but I think it's crazy because in theory you would think like you need a minimum wage because otherwise people are not going to pay you enough, and you need like a mandatory government mandated like minimum wage because otherwise people are not getting paid enough. But it's crazy that that's what I think in my mind. But it's like no, actually it's the opposite. Like if you don't really create like a minimum wage, people are still gonna getting paid fairly. So it is kind of crazy that is like it's actually the opposite of what I think I'm used to. But again, it's just like my brain it's wired differently, and I'm not in the Scandinavian model, but it makes sense. It's like yes, you know what? Actually, in practice, it's not what you think. It's actually the opposite. It's better if the government is like it's like no, you guys compromise and you guys negotiate themselves in between yourselves. It's not like we're not having a say in this, which is crazy, but apparently it works.
In politics. In most Nordic countries, social democratic parties have dominated politics since the 1930s, but they formed a consensus with other parties, like liberals, conservatives, and farmers,
the ideal.
not just to push through the necessary reforms, but also to show that democracy still works and that
Yeah.
compromise in politics is
can happen.
possible. But there
Yeah.
is one more aspect that makes the Nordic model possible in the first place,
Okay,
and which
what?
also explains why it doesn't work anywhere else. This
Oh my God,
often
which is
overlooked
it?
aspect are the unique cultural values and social characteristics which can be summarized as social trust. They have been dubbed the real Nordic gold, and they are what really makes Scandinavia stand out. The thing is that if you took any given country and tried to introduce the Nordic model, redistribute the
work.
wealth through really high
Yeah.
taxes
No, it
to
wouldn't
pay
work.
for free state-provided services for everyone, chances are that it wouldn't really work. People
Yeah.
wouldn't want to give up the benefits of their hard
No.
work through high taxes, and they wouldn't trust that the state is competent
It's actually
enough
doing what they have to do.
redistribute them. But Scandinavians are willing to take part and willing to share, not just because they have to, but because they trust that it's the best thing to do.
I love to pay my taxes.
Yeah, I like paying taxes.
Det är jättebra.
Everyone's just like we love to pay
Scandinavians
taxes.
just trust both each other and their governments a lot more than anyone else. And that's the reason why they are willing to give up their wealth and support the welfare state. And the crazy thing
It's just
is that
about
although the
trust.
welfare state was born in the 1930s, this high level of trust has been in Scandinavia way before that. According to Andreas Berg, who researches this topic in Sweden, Swedes have had higher levels of trust in each other and their state way back in the 19th century, and possibly even
Oh.
before that. Which means that the high level of trust is not an outcome of the welfare politics, the culture of compromise, or the fair legal system. It's what made it possible in the first place. And that's why
Yeah, it's
without
not
this
vice
trust,
versa.
the Nordic model just won't work somewhere else. But as for
That's
why
sad.
Scandinavians trust people so much, that's a more difficult question to answer.
Exactly.
Some historians point to the influence of Lutheranism,
Lutheranism?
a Protestant branch of Christianity which was historically the state religion in Scandinavia, and which has equality and egalitarian society as one of its core values. Others argue that it's the climate, and point to a theory that people from colder climates generally have higher levels of social trust, because they had to
Wow.
historically rely on each other and their close neighbors for survival.
Oh, that
Another
makes
factor
sense.
might be that the Nordic countries have experienced a lot more internal and external stability. The last time Sweden was at war was in 1814, and the last time a leading political figure was killed in Denmark was in 1286. And while the history
Oh my
of the
God.
Nordic countries is obviously not entirely peaceful, compared to the rest of the world,
They
it's
are.
marked by much less violence and internal conflicts. And finally, there is the geography. Historically, the Scandinavian states have had large territories with long distances between settlements, which made it difficult for the Nordic kings and nobles to exercise strict control over their population. And this meant that the ruling class had to actually try to provide services for their
Okay.
citizens if they wanted to control their land,
Yeah.
rather than just collect taxes. In other words,
sense.
even back then, there was an expectation that those who rule the country should be actually doing something
They're-
useful for their people. And
They should
this
be doing
limited
their jobs.
control also enabled the rise of a class of independent farmers, which became the foundation of the future strong middle class, the backbone of the Scandinavian societies until today, and a big factor leading to a higher social trust between people. It's difficult to pinpoint one specific reason, and most likely it was a combination of all of them. But the bottom line is that the reasons which made the Nordic model possible date way back into history, and that means that the birth of the Nordic model is less about policy decisions and more about the unique combination of factors that have
That made
shaped
it
the
the way they are.
Scandinavian societies
Yeah.
for hundreds of years. And that's why it's almost impossible to recreate the Nordic model somewhere else, because
Well, that's a
while you
bummer.
can replicate some of the policies, without the underlying factors, it's not going to work, or
Yeah.
at least not as well. Obviously, the Scandinavian countries are not perfect. They definitely have their flaws, and they are dealing with their own challenges as well. But the fact is that their model has worked, and while we don't know whether their model will survive in the future or not, it has been one of the biggest success stories of the 20th
Yeah,
century.
it has worked pretty well. So I don't know why it wouldn't work, like suddenly like would stop working. But it is kind of crazy. I think there's I think, you know, there's like a really great combination of factors that I think made it, like they explain it, they made it work for them specifically. But I think obviously like all the factors, you know, because it's crazy just seeing it like that, seeing like the little model, because it's like, why wouldn't you? I think like everything works. Like I would think, you know, up until that last point of like social trust, I would have thought, you know what, I think, you know, it makes sense. I think you can sort of like replicate this somewhere else. Again, in theory, not in practice, but I think just looking at the Nordic model like this, I'm like, well, I think, you know, the welfare state, I think that's one of those things that I think gets a bad rap. Usually, not always, but I think in some countries, or just some people in general, like the welfare state gets a bad reputation because they're like, you know, they think, oh, you know, because they think like the people, you know, are gonna be sort of like leeching off the state, and they're not gonna work because they're like, oh well, it's the welfare state, like who cares? Like they're paying for everything, so I don't really have to like put in the work and actually look for a job or actually make some effort because the state's gonna take care of it. It's gonna give me subsidized housing, or you know, they're gonna give me, I don't know, benefits, money, whatever, you know, food stamps, whatever. It's like I'm not gonna have the need to actually look for a job because the state is gonna take care of it. So the welfare state, I think, gets a bad rap, but it's like, no, if you're thinking about it like that, of course it's not going to work. But you have to actually see that like the specifics of this specific like welfare state, that is not the case of like, oh, I'm just going to be, you know, lazing around in my house every day because I don't care. I don't have to look for a job because, you know, the state gives me everything. No. It's like the state, it's sort of like, and I think it sort of like closely relates to the whole compromise of like the second sort of like element. That is like, it's a compromise, and it's all about like, we're not giving you things for free. It's like, no, as long as you are sort of like committed to your part of the deal, which is, you know, you actually have to like, if you're out of a job, you actively have to look for another job. You're going to have to like look for a source of employment. And as long as you're actually putting in some effort, like we as the state are gonna help you. And again, it's a good thing. It's like, well, who wouldn't? Because I think a lot of the things and a lot of like people and a lot of like economies and countries do struggle with this, is because like if stuff happens, like, you know, you lose your job, you're just gonna be like, wow, what the state is not helping me. Not always, but because again, it's not a generalized thing. Some countries do actually, like, you know, they're part of the deal is, you know, helping people that are unemployed. they will help them. But I think the idea behind this is like, again, it's like a rehab program. Like a successful rehab program, like should be about you reintegrating yourself into society. It's not just about, I don't know, keeping you, the idea again is like you want people to thrive. So again, it's like, it's like a rehab program. Like you want people to actually, they detox, and then you're actually going to help them reintegrate. So look for a job, look for a house, and actually like being successful and lead successful and happy lives. So I think it's more like that, but usually, obviously, that's the case. If you don't really have a support system, again, it's going to be hard to actually thrive and be, the best version of yourself, because of course you're going to need outside help, especially if you're like in this situation of like, I'm out of a job, I don't have a house. Like, how am I exactly going to have a house if I don't have a job? Like those kind of things. And it's like, well, yeah, if the state actually helps you, it's going to help you actually reintegrate yourself, and it's going to be easier for you, which I think it's good. And I think a lot of people actually do get to see, or some people do see that as sort of like a bad thing, because they either think, you're not gonna actually fulfill your part of the deal, and you're just gonna be, laying it around there, helping, like the state's gonna take care of it. Or it's the opposite. Maybe you're thinking, no, people should actually do everything for themselves. I think it's really like an individualistic thing of like, oh, you're self-made. Like you didn't really got any outside help. And I think a lot of people tend to see that as better of like, oh, you did it all by yourself. So I think it's more like your story is more successful if you didn't got outside help. But I think that's crazy, because it's like, no, everyone needs help. It's like, that's why humans, and we live in a society, and it's good that people actually can help each other out. And that goes for both people as in like society, other members of society, other humans, and actually, the state or the government. Like, it's a good thing. Like, there's no shame in asking for help. And I think a lot of people, you have to like break that barrier of like, it's a bad thing, you're asking for help. It's like, no, that's not a bad thing. Like, we as humans, and like we can see it like more like the societies that tend to be more successful are societies that really do rely on other people and on a sense of community to actually thrive. So it is a good idea. But I think humans, for some reason, or maybe it's just, again, not everyone, but I think maybe some societies or some countries do value a lot of like, they put a lot of value on individualism, and that you should do everything by yourself, which is like, no, there's like a sense of community. It's a good thing because we can help each other out. And, in the long term, it's better, as we can clearly see. But it is kind of like, on one hand, I think that's a big part of it all. And obviously, like the great compromise of like, yes, I'm trusting, I think, again, because, and that goes again with the social trust, which is like, what's actually, it's like, I can negotiate, the whole thing about like what I was mentioning earlier about like the minimum wage, for instance. It's like, yes, I'm trusting you as in you, like the employer, for instance, that you're providing. I'm not gonna, unionize. I'm not gonna complain. But as long as you're actually like fulfilling your part of the deal, which is like offering me, a living wage, and I don't have to be overworked. But I think a lot of people like, what's stopping us from like, like actually implementing this model somewhere else? It's like, or you, for instance, negotiating that with your employer. What would you think? It's like, well, if I ask anyone, I think they would be like, I don't trust them. Like, it sounds good in theory. Yes, sounds great, incredible. But what's stopping them because if they don't really have, I think probably an incentive. If I'm not seeing an incentive of like, oh, but what's going to happen? Like, are they going to be fined if they do not fulfill their deal? Or, and it's the other way around as well. Like the employer can say to the employee, like, well, if you're not like doing your job properly, like what's stopping you? I'm not going to pay you, because if you're not, again, I fulfilled my part of the deal, which was like, yes, I'm going to pay you enough, but what's happening, and you're not going to be overworked, but what's happening if you're not fulfilling your own deal, which is like, either you're doing a lousy job, or you're not, that's usually probably what they're complaining about. So it is kind of like, I think on both parts and on both parties, it's the thing about trust. Like, you're not trusting them to actually like do that. It's like, yes, I can say that. Yeah, sure. Like, what's stopping me from like, no, let's take the government out of the equation. Let's just negotiate our deal between ourselves. But it's like, there's nothing that's stopping them from like not actually like fulfilling it. I think there's like a distinct lack of social trust that I think actually bleeds out into like the other things and the other sort of like elements of the model that I think, you know, that's why they make it like so hard to replicate. Because at the end of the day, I think it's all about trust, and that's probably the most important part of the whole thing. And like they mentioned in the video, it's actually like the hardest part to actually to replicate, because the other things are, again, things that I can be like, well, I think we can like try to replicate this. But if you don't have the trust, and you also, as you know, the citizen, you don't have the trust in the government, again, like I'm willing to pay higher taxes, but if it means that I'm actually going to see the benefits. But the thing is, I'm not trusting the government to actually like invest that money properly, for instance. So if I'm not trusting the government, of course I'm not gonna be like, no, do not raise my taxes, please. So it is a thing about, yes, it's the social trust that I think is kind of inexistent in other places, and sadly, that's why it's like, yes, it's a bummer actually, that it's like, that's the most important part, and it's like a whole element of things that actually made it like those Scandinavian countries to actually be able to have like a high level of social trust. And like they mentioned, like nobody actually knows exactly like why they are the way they are, but we can all agree that it's all a factor, like it's a mix of several circumstances, including like historical and cultural, and actually like even like religion, but that also like goes hand in hand with the history. So you can't actually change those things in other places, because again, it's like history and cultural values that I think you can actually do change the cultural values, but it's harder. You know, I think changing a society's cultural values, it takes so many generations. It takes like a lot of years. It's possible, but it is like a huge like long-term situation and a long-term model that you're not going to actually reap the benefits, and you're going to see the benefits in like 20, 30 or 50 years. It's like a long-term thing, and it's like you're going to have to like, I'm going to accept, you know, the fact that we're trying to change, but I'm not gonna see it because it's gonna be like 100 years from now. So I'm not saying it's impossible, but it is a little bit impossible, just because I think you can try to replicate it, but again, you would need to change like the cultural value and the cultural model of countries, and that's not an easy thing to do, and it's not a fast thing to do. But you know, it would be great for like a social experiment. I would love a country to actually do that, but again, I'm not gonna see if it's gonna be successful, because like I mentioned, it's gonna take like so many generations. But it is kind of crazy and sad at the same time that, you know, they're the only ones that can do this, because, you know, it's like a specific set of circumstances that made it the way they are. But yeah, maybe people, I don't know, but I was gonna say, maybe we can actually like, some countries should actually like adapt this and try to actually, you know, replicate the Nordic model. But a lot of them have tried and have failed terribly. So you know what, it's like, I don't know if like we should continue to replicate this. Maybe a more probably successful model will be to just sort of like adapt it to each country's like a specific cultural views and cultural values and history, and see if that might work. I don't know, I'm putting it out there, but again, it's like, it made me kind of sad to see like that they're the only ones that can be successful, because again, it's like, it's particular to them. So it's like, what a bummer. It's kind of so sad. It's sad actually. But that was it for today, and I'll see you soon. Bye.